Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Blake Jackson. I'm a staff attorney and policy officer here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative based at the University of Arkansas. We want to welcome you to our Cultivating Tribal Food Sovereignty series, where we're going through and providing a series of trainings on things that you might want to think about from a food sovereignty perspective. And one of these that we're talking about today is developing your own tribal department of agriculture. What that means, what you need to think about, kind of giving you some tools to guide those conversations and things that you might want to consider going forward, so that you can have better informed conversations on these things and also have follow-up items with our team if you want to discuss further. So without further ado, I will go ahead and kick this thing off. So today, just to kind of give you a roadmap for where this discussion is headed at this point, we're going to do a little bit, just a couple slides about our work, so you know a little bit of a baseline of what we do if this is your first time joining us. I will talk about implementing a Department of Agriculture and some things you might want to think about in terms of doing that. I will turn it over to Erin Parker, who is our Tribal Research Director, to talk about some of our model code that we've developed for tribes that want to kind of take this as a starting place. Then we will turn it over to Josiah Griffin, our Policy and Program Specialist, to talk about federal funding opportunities that are available if you want to start a tribal department of ag from the federal level, and some of the things that state departments of ag have access to that might be opportunities that we're leaving on the table if tribes aren't really occupying this space. And lastly, I'll turn it over to Carly Griffith-Hotvet, who is our Director of Tribal Enterprise, and she's going to give some firsthand perspectives as to what you might want to think about from the inside looking out, and what this could mean in terms of administrative efficiencies and implementation based on her experience from Muskogee Creek Nation. So without further ado, talking a little bit about our work. So just a baseline familiarity for those that are new. We are the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We were initially established as part of the University of Arkansas School of Law in 2013 by both the dean of the law school then, who was Stacy Leeds, who is now ascended to the role of Vice Chancellor of Economic Development. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and a very prominent Indian law scholar and attorney, alongside our founding director, Janie Sims Hipp, who was the Undersecretary for Tribal Relations under Secretary Vilsack and the Director of the Office of Tribal Relations. Janie was previously on faculty here, came back, started the initiative, and has now moved over to be the Executive Director of the Native American Agriculture Fund, which was formed out of the Keepsey Settlement. Recently, in July of 2018, Vice Chancellor Leeds ascended to the role of Vice Chancellor of Economic Development, as we discussed. With that, though, our office transitioned with her to the Office of Economic Development with other entrepreneurial entities. And this is a really good way to elevate and fit our mission of enhancing the wellness in tribal communities by advancing healthy food systems, diversified economic development, and cultural food traditions in Indian country. Now, that's our mission statement, but what does that mean? What does that mean when we talk about in terms of what work we do? When you put pen to paper, what does that mean? We like to think of ourselves as helping to put the tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty. And we kind of take a three-pronged approach to do this. We do this through legal analysis that we provide, policy research, handouts, webinars, trainings such as these, and other educational resources to kind of further drive home that mission in helping Indian country through food sovereignty, agriculture, and economic development. Because if you really think about it, yes, food sovereignty is its own meaning, but we know that in Indian country, tribal sovereignty has a very specific and very special meaning, and it has since time immemorial. And we want to recognize that and make sure that the two are both equally understood as being vital parts of this movement going forward. So as part of a starting point in this food sovereignty discussion, you really have to think about, where does the effort of that live within your tribal government? And we think of that as being a Department of Agriculture, because if you look at, in terms of parity, in terms of local, state, county, national governments, a lot of these places that interface well together have some sort of department that is recognized well, right? Well, a Department of Agriculture fits that framework. And it also kind of can serve as a home for different things according to your tribe's priorities. This can cover everything from professional staff development, such as tribal youth internship programs for agriculture and natural resource professionals, some sort of professional staff sharing arrangement with your land management folks at your tribe. It can serve as a place to keep institutional knowledge, such as seed keeping, federal grant and funding recipients, having oversight of programmatic activities, much like your Department of Health and Human Services and your Department of Interior authorities for 638. As we see an expansion of those within USDA at the federal level, this can serve as an in-house place where these administrative opportunities live. And more importantly, if someone has something to do with agriculture externally, one of your collaborators at the state, local, or a national level, who do they contact? A lot of times if these efforts are scattered throughout a larger tribe, there's not really a uniform point of contact. Well, if you have a Department of Agriculture under which all these things live, that can serve as that centralized point of contact to which that person can reach out to, and then the information can be appropriately funneled from there. So that's kind of an overview of what we're talking about. But now let's get a little bit more in depth into that discussion. So in terms of developing a Department of Ag and implementing, what do you want to do? Where do you want to concentrate your efforts? So it's kind of one of those things that if you build it, they will come. In front, one of my favorite movies, Field of Dreams, it kind of inspired me on this discussion, because you kind of have to set up the framework for those opportunities to exist, right? So you have to really think of what your goal or purpose of your tribal agricultural operation is going to be, and what's going to live there. Is it going to be some sort of regulatory entity, maybe regulating some sort of activity within your jurisdiction? Is it going to be more of an outreach technical assistance or education and youth programming effort, such as the Cooperative Extension Service does at the local and state level? Is it going to provide more of a community service? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Is it going to be something that you're going to use to make grants with tribal money? Or is it going to be more of a traditional knowledge and seed keeping entity? These are not entities that have to be mutually exclusive, and this is obviously not an exhaustive list. These are things that are a starting point for these discussions going forward. So if you're setting up a tribal Department of Ag, you really need to think about the component parts of your operation. Now, one of my favorite games to play as a kid was Operation, which was the skill game where you kind of operate on the guy and it kind of buzzes if you hit the board, right? So in this, you got to kind of be precise in how you do it to make sure that you're not getting beyond the scope of your efforts, but also you're implementing efforts in a way that is a phased approach so that you have the right capacity and the right infrastructure in place for these efforts to grow and to have sustainable progress. So if you're looking at component parts of your operation, let's talk about the regulatory entity piece. A lot of folks are familiar with the fact that in 2018, the 2018 Farm Bill had authorities for you to regulate hemp on your reservation. If you wanted to go through and do so, you had to meet, submit a plan, and the federal government had to approve your plan to do so if it met federal requirements. Well, a lot of people are going in the direction of regulating hemp on their reservation, but that can kind of be a point where you can put your tribal Department of Ag over that, because that's also, regulated at the federal level by USDA and at the state level by state departments of Ag. So kind of having that counter component to make sure that these are mirror structures of one another so that they interface well, because you might have an opportunity where there might be some sort of question that comes up as to jurisdiction. And if these people know this is where they need to go, then that could be a starting point for those conversations. And similarly with food safety, we have the Food Safety Modernization Act, which tribes have their ability to regulate food safety on their reservation, but there could be instances of jurisdiction that might come up. So if you're regulating fresh produce, the state might have a question, or the tribe might have a question if there's some sort of jurisdictional issue. So having a place for these entities to exist, but also occupying that regulatory space to send a signal to other sovereigns that, hey, we've got this covered, and here's how we're exercising our sovereignty in a meaningful and deliberate way. Another place that you might think that you can put your efforts within your Department of Ag is for conservation and land management efforts. This could also include your natural resource, your pieces. For instance, if you're kind of doing more technical services, you can have natural resource conservation programs sign up through your Department of Ag, helping the producers on your reservation do that. Specifically, programs that people might be familiar with in this vein are the Conservation Stewardship Program, which is CSP, the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, and EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. You can also concentrate your forest and timber management operations here, and that includes 638 authority that the Department of Agriculture will be implementing through U.S. Forest Service. And we'll get some more details on that later in the summer as there's a couple webinars scheduled as to what that authority really is going to look like. It could be a cost share for federal programs. If you have some sort of federal grant with infrastructure that's going to come through, there might be some way to implement a tribal share of that program so that the federal government will put their part in and you can get a new project on the reservation. Again, a technical service provider, we talked about that a little bit with the NRCS programs being one piece of that. Another piece of that is the agricultural resource management plans that are part of ARMA. A lot of tribes have agricultural resource management plans in their own entity, but this can also live within a Department of Ag with those discussions. So a few more component parts to think about with your operation include your education and youth programming. We have a youth leadership summit as part of our programming at IFAI. If your tribe wanted to do something like that for tribal members on the reservation, they could do that as part of a leadership development effort if you had some sort of agricultural education component to that. You can have a young producers, youth advisory board to kind of guide these efforts and to kind of see what the next generation of producers looks like on your reservation. You could also have young farmer or rancher loans or grants, much like at the federal level, if there's some sort of counterpart for the tribal component at the local level to exist. And also you can have an FFA and 4-H livestock program. A lot of places have done this. My tribe has done this at the local level where we have a school that's administered on our tribal boarding school. They have their own 4-H program where they actually have livestock show animals. So that's one thing. Federal administration and pass-through. Again, we talked about 638 efforts. One of the things in the new Farm Bill was for the 638 authority under the FDIPR program, the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations, where you can procure food as part of this program and tap into that local market and give local producers a guaranteed market for their crops. That authority is still being developed and implemented, but that could be a place for this to live. And similarly, NRCS has a similar component to 638, which is an alternative funding arrangement where the tribal government can step in and administer directly at the local level some of the conservation programs through NRCS, much like a 638 would look. A couple more things to think about. Community outreach. A lot of tribes have community gardens, just as kind of a gesture to establishing food sovereignty on the reservation, and also implementing tools and making it easier to access healthy and nutritious foods for elders and community citizens. So a tribal Department of Ag can oversee that aspect through community outreach. It could also serve as a entity to kind of interface with farm to school efforts. If you want to connect local producers to local school farm to school efforts, this can serve as an administration of those things. Also, if you're looking to provide local producers a market and a place for food, if you want to serve locally produced tribal foods at your tribal cultural events and tribal gatherings, this can serve as an instance for that at the community outreach level. But kind of shifting away from that, you can also think of this as a for-profit side of things. If you have tribal enterprise headquarters for your enterprises. So agritourism is a good example of that. If you have some sort of entity that you have shopped out your food and agricultural operations to raise some sort of alternate revenue stream through agritourism. If your tribe has a ranching operation itself, this can serve as administrating that effort. And also if you have some sort of tribal greenhouse efforts where you're growing produce for the community, this can serve as another piece of that. So once you've thought of those efforts and thought about your component plans, about what you want to live in the Department of Ag, what might kind of be your phased approach, you're going to have to think about your needs. You're going to have to think about your internal needs of the tribe and your external needs of the tribe. And this is going to give you kind of a primer in some of these areas that I'm going to discuss on this slide. Carly's going to talk a little bit more about some of these later. Specifically, I think she's got a lot more input on the staff piece. But thinking about the number of staff that you want to hire, you know, if you're going to implement a new department, how many people are you going to need to hire? You're going to have to think of that in terms of your salary calculations, job descriptions, fringe benefits. What does that look like? What does your reporting structure look like to tribal leadership? Is this going to be a department that has some sort of independent authority? Is it going to live within some sort of larger interior services department? What kind of delineation authority are your officials going to have? Something that in my previous role in my career, I was in-house counsel for my tribe. I wanted the in-house counsel there. And one thing that we had to think about in the legal department was, you know, what delineation of authority do people have in signing agreements of certain dollar amounts? So that's something to really think about is, you know, you're going to have some seasonal agreements that are going to kind of go, because obviously you're dealing with living things in the agricultural sector with growing seasons and gestation periods for livestock. So production contracts are going to have a different flavor of their own, and you're going to have to think about what kind of authority do the people signing those have, and what needs to be going up to a higher level in a chain of command for dollar amounts. Again, necessary competencies of staff. This is going to vary depending on what you put in the component parts of that operation. If you're going to have a lot of growing going on, you're going to need to think about maybe hiring an agronomist, or if you have a food safety issue coming up, you need to at least probably have a food safety expert on call, or on contract, if not a full-time member. Thinking about interfacing with other tribal departments and policies. Think of this in terms of your shared services. Are you going to have legal counsel that you use internal to the tribe? If something comes up in an ag law issue, is in-house counsel appropriate for that, or do you need to hire a specialist for that? How do you work with your human resources department? Do you have a statutory designation to hire things to hire in a certain way? Is the ag department exempt from that? What kind of policies and how does that interface with the larger pieces of that within your tribe? And if there's any, if you have some sort of grant that you're administering through the tribe and the salary being paid by grant funds, there might be some federal requirements for those staff. You know, that's something to be mindful of too. But that's obviously going to be the barometer that's going to change according to what opportunities you have available and you apply for. I'm specifically talking a little bit more about staffing, making sure that you having the right professionals and skilled employees. You're kind of building that internal base. You know, you're building your institutional knowledge and your internal experience, and you have a steady vision of leadership and execution with that. This can also serve as a good way to recruit your young graduates, making sure that you're having opportunities available for people to come back and work for their tribe, you know, either through externships or fellowship placements while they're in school, or some sort of placement opportunities afterwards. One thing that we keep talking about in Indian country is building a bench of young professionals, and this could be an excellent way to do that. Having your staff for the right program goals, we've talked about that a little bit. Training current staff on desired skills, because it could look unique depending on what you're doing. And sharing staff with other partners. You know, there might be some tribes that are close together and you might be able to share some professionals on some level. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing is food inspection authority could be a good example of that. If your tribe has a food inspection authority and the local level is kind of lagging, maybe there could be an opportunity to outsource part of your staff and capture some additional revenue by a cost share program. So we've talked about internal needs, but what about external needs and tribal leadership? Are the things that you're putting in that component operation, are those matched up with the larger community of tribal citizens around there? You know, you're not going to put a growing operation in if you don't have a lot of produce growers, and it's more of a livestock heavy area. You know, things to think about, making sure that you're aligning yourself with those local priorities, making sure that you've kind of done your feasibility studies if necessary, and if there's not the internal expertise to do that, hiring the necessary consulting services to conduct those studies and give you that research to kind of tell you what the bottom line is going to look like. Is this going to be a profitable entity going forward? You know, because it's not going to have the same return as gaming, and kind of helping manage those expectations with having those conversations with tribal leaders. If your tribe has a larger vision of being more service oriented rather than profit driven in certain aspects, are the focuses of your Department of Ag going to align with the larger vision of what the tribe's trying to do and what leadership wants to do? The firsthand involvement of tribal leaders, scheduling tours once you have things up and going so people can really see the good work going on the ground level so that you have that tribal leader buy-in and you continue to have that as you go. This one was an interesting one, was determining your structure. Is this going to be a department within the tribe? Is it going to have a 501c3 tax exempt arm? Because if you have a tax exempt arm, that might open up more funding opportunities being a nonprofit, because that might not always be available to a straight up department within a tribe. Which kind of speaks to the next piece of this, is finding a way to implement your plan and get sources of revenue. Are you going to have a fee-driven enterprise? So for example, are you going to, if you're regulating hemp on your reservation, are you going to charge a fee for hemp licenses? What's the fee for that going to look like? Are you going to have an inspection fee for someone coming out to examine your produce fields? Is there going to be a set aside and current tribal revenues coming in from other operations until you're able to kind of make this sustain its own? Is there an opportunity for tribal state compacting? We talked about that at the local level with the food inspection authorities, but that can be something that could be built out at a larger level. Federal grant opportunities, keeping in mind that the federal government has money out there that tribes are eligible recipients of. And Josiah will talk a little bit more about that and the external opportunities. Also external private opportunities, looking at private philanthropy, kind of where that all fits in. The next slide, we talk about federal funding, looking at rural development grants, conservation program benefits, infrastructure, environmental assets, thinking in terms of what's available at the USDA level. If you have more of a natural resource focus, that might fit kind of some sort of secondary or tertiary focus of your Department of Ag. Looking at EPA, for example, BIA might have some money available. External funding, private grant makers like NAF, the Native American Agriculture Fund, and First Nations Development Institute. Credit opportunities, capital donations, and gifts are also good places to look here. But with that, now that you've decided that you want to go forward with this, and you have your component parts decided, and you've decided your staff, you've got to look at the bigger picture within your tribe and figure out how you're going to structure this and where does it live and what kind of authority do you have. Is this going to be a department that is constitutionally vested? Is that, that's going to be something that's going to have more insulation from political changes that might happen with different tribal elections and administrations changing. If it's constitutionally vested, that's going to be more of a permanent fixture. As well as tribal code. If you've got some steady leadership that has supported this and you have more of those people in office, putting it in code is going to ensure that it's also going to be around longer. But if it's more of an administrative priority for your tribal chairperson, doing so through a tribal proclamation is also possible. It's all about how you want to exercise that sovereignty according to how permanent you want to make this entity. But you also need to think about where it falls within your governmental structure. Do you have a tripartite government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches, like many tribes? Do you have a tribal business council that you report to? Or is this some sort of 501c3 entity that you're making? You see this a lot sometimes with tribal conservation districts being 501c3s to be eligible for more funding from private entities. What kind of authority do they have? Are they still tribal employees? These are all things to consider in how these puzzle pieces fit together. An example, this was previously shared in our call to action webinar, but I wanted to bring it back up again. These are things that might fit within your Department of Ag if you want the visual spread of that. Looking at your youth programs, extension, food and nutrition programs, your ARMP, land management, compliance regulation, enterprise, all of that can live within a Department of Ag. And this is by no means exhaustive, and it's by no means mandated, obviously, but this is a good example of where to go. Again, these slides will be available in a follow-up email, and this webinar is being recorded if I haven't said that already. So again, don't feel like you have to write all this down right now because it'll be available to you later. But once you have that division of ag and natural resources, this could be an example of where it falls within the structure of a larger tribal government. And thinking about how you might have interface with other departments, as you can see here. FDPR might be in another part, but you might have some sort of interface with FDPR in terms of 638 and hooking up local producers with that FDPR market share. You might have some sort of conservation efforts that might need to be some sort of tie to the Tribal Conservation Commission. So these are all things to think about and things to really have as a starting point in these conversations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin Parker, our research director, to talk about some of the model code framework that we've developed and what the benefit of having a tribal department of ag can be, and where to go from here. So Erin, if you would like to take over.
Absolutely. Thank you, Blake. And thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to keep it pretty brief because I know Blake and some of our other colleagues have some more great information to share with you about this topic. But I just wanted to highlight a resource that we have at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative that can help you get started with establishing a Department of Agriculture. And once you have established that Department of Agriculture, or whatever you want to call that entity that's going to house all of these pieces that are promoting your sovereignty in the space of food and agriculture, there are also a lot of other pieces of this code that could help you build out the work of that Department of Agriculture and really record that in tribal law so that it has a really firm foundation. And as Blake said, may be insulated from any kind of political changes going forward, that it's a part of your tribal governance structure moving forward. So the Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code project was a project that's ongoing, honestly, here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We just added a big piece of it this morning. You may have seen our Model Hemp Code that was released. Blake was a huge part of that. This whole project, though, is really a holistic look at how the law, and tribal law specifically, can set a foundation for long-term food systems work within a particular tribal nation. And the idea is that it's a series of tribal laws that can be tailored to that tribal food system and really do whatever you want the law to do and protect in the space of food systems. That's what this is designed to do. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it just because our very first chapter of this 19 different title model code is how to establish a Department of Agriculture. And within that establishing a Department of Agriculture section of our Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code, you will find a draft model law that your tribe could pick up and look at, see if that's something that would help you institute the kind of Department of Agriculture that you want. It lays out some establishing language for that Department of Agriculture. There's some model language that sets some goals for what that Department of Agriculture might be. And there's also a long series of subject matters that Department of Agriculture might be regulating over or have really under its umbrella of things that you want it to do. It's just model language, so it's highly changeable. It's really meant to be kind of a starting point for a tribe that wants to do this work, and you can kind of plug and play what you want to do in your food system. We just sort of built a template to help get folks started. So the very first chapter of that food code is how to establish a Department of Agriculture, and a lot of the different considerations that Blake has already walked through and that our other colleagues, Carly and Josiah, are going to walk through after me, are things that you can take once you've made those decisions and put that into that legal template, that legal language. And once it's passed, that's your kind of foundation to build this entity, this Department of Agriculture within the tribal nation. But the food code does a lot of different other things. Once you've got that Department of Agriculture established, you can look at all of these different things that you see here on the screen as things that Department of Agriculture might be able to do and protect. So there's a chapter addressing protecting traditional foods and seeds in our model food code. There's a chapter addressing food safety in our model food code. There's a chapter addressing agricultural business entities in our model food code, and all of those things are things that you might be thinking that a Department of Agriculture could be sort of that entity that would be the regulator for within the tribe. So we have model language on all of those subject matters as well that can kind of help you build that out. But the starting point, I think, since we're talking about departments of agriculture today, for us when we developed that model food code was really the establishment of that Department of Ag. So that's the very first chapter in our code. And if you want to see that and read it, you can get it for free. The website is here on the screen. It's tribalfoodcode.com. You do have to create an account just to be able to see it and log in. That just kind of helps us track some metrics and make sure that it's sort of protected and behind a wall wall so that only tribal nations are really being able to access that. But it's a free to create an account, and once you create an account, you can read the whole thing. It's over 1,000 pages, so definitely set aside some time if you feel like you're a super nerd and want to read the whole thing. But if you just want to start with that one chapter, you can download that individually as the Department of Ag, and that will be a really good starting point, just legally speaking, to establish that within the tribal governance structure that you're working with. I think there's one more slide that I've got here. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so really, again, I know Blake has already covered some of this, so I don't want to spend too much more time on it. But really, we developed this code project as a way for tribal nations to pick it up and use it to express their sovereignty in the space of food and agriculture. And doing that legally and adopting those standards, or creating a Department of Agriculture, whatever you want to do in food and agriculture, using your laws to do that, to set your own standards and to occupy that regulatory space, is a really strong signal for you as a sovereign nation that you are standing in that space, that you are protecting your foods, you're protecting your producers of those foods, your gatherers of those foods, and that the tribe as a sovereign nation is making decisions about food systems and not any other regulator within your jurisdiction. That is your that is your foundation of food code, to be able to express those things in law and protect them long term. So that was really the goal that we set out to accomplish when we kind of created the Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code. And I hope that anybody who's using that to create a Department of Agriculture finds it useful. But all of that, again, is on our website for the food code, tribalfoodcode.com. If you have any trouble accessing it, please reach out to anybody here on this call. I know our staff's going to have our contact information, I think is the very last slide. Please always reach out to us anytime about this project. We're happy to help. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, Blake.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Thank you, Erin. That was a great overview of our food code. And like Erin said, that is a free resource for all tribes to use, and we're happy to guide those conversations in terms of how you want to implement that. With regard to developing a Department of Ag, establishing a sort of a hemp regulatory plan, as she detailed in the recent release of an updated provision, or anything that you guys would like to walk through, our staff's available for those planning calls as well, to work with you, tribal leaders, your tribal legal counsel, and all those players in that conversation. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Josiah Griffin, and kind of talking about some of the other things you might want to think about from a federal perspective in terms of this. Josiah?
Thank you, Blake. So my name is Josiah Griffin. I'm a program and policy specialist with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. And before joining IFAI, I had spent about 4.5 years in the belly of the beast at USDA, first interning with the Office of External and Intergovernmental Affairs, which works primarily with state gubernatorial offices and state departments of agriculture. And then I switched over to spending the majority of that time, about 4 years, in the Office of Tribal Relations. So I got to see a little bit of the nuance of how USDA interacts differently and similarly between different government structures. And as you're working or looking to work with federal agencies and partners, one of the first facets of the discussion that you might come across is data. Well, and being able to provide and define your data sources to help strengthen the rationale for both the partnerships and also targeted funding opportunities is so important to the longevity of these discussions. Now, here we want to point out that the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, which every 5 years issues a Census of Agriculture, which is a comprehensive data collection for agricultural production in the United States, will actually provide funding for enumerators to go out to communities to collect that data. Now, NAS for the past 30+ years has had cooperative agreements with state departments of agriculture and NASDA, the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, to hire and house these enumerators to work throughout their communities to collect the data that NAS then uses and internalizes for that Census of Agriculture. NAS has historically worked with and supported the payment of tribal enumerators. But in developing a Department of Agriculture, that department can really serve as a centralized source to house those employees, to ensure that that data is collected in a way that is meaningful and appropriate, keeping in mind that all NASS data is confidential at the farm level, and to help support the salary, travel expenses, and other costs that would be necessary for even potentially your tribal citizens to go out and fulfill that role. It provides employment opportunities while at the same time providing that source of information to help move these conversations forward. So next slide. So as you're looking at, especially once the framework for that data has been built out, and we've been able to kind of work through and support kind of knowing where and who the agricultural production is in your communities or in your area, USDA also has some funding opportunities for helping to build out what the agricultural markets that you're looking at actually look like, and to help strengthen the viability of their operations moving forward. So in particular, and the resources that I'm talking about here won't be all inclusive, but it's a helpful overview of some of the opportunities that you might find in USDA and in working with other federal and private partners. But the USDA Rural Business Development Grant through USDA's Rural Development Agency actually provides funding for feasibility studies, business planning, and training to support job creation. And that job creation can work and exist in the agriculture and food systems arena. Now, it's important to know here that as you're looking at, or as you might be looking at RBDG or the Rural Business Development Grant, that the end beneficiary who is receiving the support generally must be separate from the actual applicant. That end beneficiary can still be a tribal enterprise if the governing body of that tribal enterprise is separate from the tribal government and council and not subject to removal without cause. That's how rural development is defining that line of separation in this case. But it can also provide a slew of benefits for even local agricultural production and producers or youth that may be interested in taking a step into this space by helping to support both studies for how those businesses or production cycles or growers might want to structure their enterprise under tribal and federal laws, as well as for the tribe and the Tribal Department of Agriculture to take an active stance and step in promoting agribusiness incubation and the training for the growers who might be interested in taking a look at this space, building out their own agribusiness entities, and supporting food access in your communities. So next slide, please. So as we're building out and continuing to look at opportunities for tribal departments of agriculture, we also felt like it was important to at least indicate where current funding models exist for state departments of agriculture, and potentially a space where a tribal department of agriculture could pursue parity with the federal government and with the US Department of Agriculture in funding models. Now, one of these areas is with the agricultural marketing and the agricultural marketing service, which provides funds for state departments of agriculture and other entities through a couple of different programs here. One being the Federal State Marketing Improvement Grant, which requires a one-to-one match for research and innovation of agricultural markets. And another opportunity provided by the Agricultural Marketing Service is the Specialty Crop Block Grant, which allows or supports state departments of agriculture in enhancing the competitiveness of specialty crops. Now, the Agricultural Marketing Service sets parameters for what specialty crops are considered, but the state departments of agriculture, as the primary applicant, can then go in through their applications to define and identify which specialty crops that State Department of Agriculture is actively pursuing or supporting the competitiveness of through that project. And in developing a tribal Department of Agriculture, a tribe may be creating an institution that supports, I mean, quote unquote, the justification for like funding opportunities that are otherwise currently available to states and state agencies. Now, admittedly, the parity in this funding may require some legislative change, but it's important to take that first step in creating an entity or a body that allows the start of that conversation for what parity may look like moving forward, if that is an avenue that you're looking to pursue. Next slide. So as departments of agriculture, or as you build out your Department of Agriculture, it is possible for that Department of Agriculture to serve as a centralized warehouse for different resources that agricultural production operations and agricultural activities in your communities may need to make sure that they maintain viability and strength both in their markets as well as in response to different circumstances that they come across. USDA issues disaster designations on a county by county basis for natural disasters that impact agricultural production. Now currently, USDA primarily provides that information to state departments of agriculture, to gubernatorial offices, and to congressional offices. But as you develop departments of agriculture, or as you develop other departments or institutions within the government, within your tribal government, it allows for more direct relationship building between those two departments to make sure that communication between the federal level and your tribal government is strengthened, so that that information can then be disseminated to the producers and enterprises that you're working with. As you're building out what that outreach and engagement for your local community looks like, it's also important to recognize that USDA offices and agencies regularly offer membership for committees and councils that inform USDA processes and activities. Now, those committees and councils operate on all levels from local to national. And so there are a slew of potential opportunities for tribal citizens and for tribal growers, American Indian and Alaska Native food producers, to come in and help strengthen what USDA does for tribal nations, and help and better inform how USDA prioritizes these opportunities to support Indian country initiatives. So next slide, please. So as we continue to look at partnership opportunities that are available through USDA, it's important to recognize the opportunity for cooperative agreements. As tribal departments of agriculture serve as single points of contact for agricultural projects and initiatives, there are a number of different agencies within the federal government that have cooperative agreement authorities to support agricultural initiatives and priorities that may be important to the federal government, but that may also be important to making sure that the tribes and the communities that you're working with have appropriate access to those resources as well. That we have 3 of them listed here in USDA, but there are others to consider. So in USDA, as we're talking about the Farm Service Agency, FSA offers cooperative agreements to support financial trainings and value-added production and record keeping, property inheritance, and crop production. That is subject to FSA's availability and access to federal appropriations. So that is something to keep in mind here. But the Natural Resource Conservation Service, as Blake mentioned earlier, also has cooperative agreements that they've issued to further NRCS's mission and to further the engagement and accessibility of USDA conservation programs. Now, the Office of Tribal Relations and the Office of the Secretary is a one-stop shop in USDA for tribal issues and questions and opportunities. And OTR has additional cooperative agreement authorities here to support the coordination and effectiveness of federal programs and primarily USDA programs. As we look toward other federal agencies, though, FDA also has cooperative agreements that they've used to work with states to help states in assessing their produce landscapes and support information and outreach and awareness of produce food safety activities. So as you are based on these conversations and based on the discussions that are available to what would be like institutions at the state level, you're creating the platform to help, quote unquote, justify what parity means. So as you are looking at developing that central point of contact for activities that support engagement and coordination at the federal level while operating on tribal lands and in Indian country. And that discretionary funding that is available through these opportunities can provide more targeted tribal projects if and when the agencies that you're working with know who to contact in the Tribal Department of Agriculture. So next slide. So with that, I will turn it back over to Blake. So thank you.
Thank you, Josiah. That was really helpful, and your perspective is always great to hear from, firsthand USDA and what it might look like on the other side of those conversations. And I think it's especially helpful to have framed kind of the chicken and egg problem that might go on. Some people might be hesitant to go there and make a Department of Ag, if there might be some statutory change required for some of those authorities, but at the same time, the legislation might not change unless there's a justified need and people can demonstrate, hey, we have these departments of ag that don't have access. We need parity to this funding like our counterparts. So that's a great point to raise, and for those discussions, and why all the more importance is needed to develop those points of contact and the flexibility we need. But at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to another colleague. I'm going to turn it over to Carly Hotvet, our Director of Tribal Research, to talk about some management perspectives from a Department of Agriculture implementation. So Carly, whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks Blake. Again, my name is Carly Hotvet. I'm the Director of Tribal Enterprise here at the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. And I've been with the initiative for a few months, since October. And before that, I was the founding director of the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the Muscogee Creek Nation. And what that means is I was headhunted out of the Attorney General's office there at Muscogee Creek Nation to come over and reorganize some existing ag and natural resource programs to really become more of a collaborative and interactive division. And there are a few different challenges that came up with that. And so I'm here to offer some of my perspectives about things to consider when your tribe is looking at developing a Department of Agriculture, what you want to focus on, some of the unexpected considerations that may need to come up as you're moving forward. But there was a definite need for organization, because a lot of the programs that touched on agriculture were involved with land management from a production perspective or from a natural resource management perspective, were kind of scattered from a managerial oversight. And by creating that division and bringing those programs in under the same programmatic umbrella, it allowed them to begin to work together much more fluidly and for the benefit of the entire nation, instead of being kind of siloed in their own individual programs. And as we move forward, there were a lot of components that were required. You heard Aaron talk about, the model food and agriculture code, and you may even need to, in addition to adopting that, you may even need legislation necessary to reorganize or create a Department of Agriculture, depending upon what current programs or organizational structures are already in place at your tribe, or even, what the preferences of your policymakers. But we're going to talk about hiring and staffing issues, location and proximity challenges, and then the internal roles and external roles, for our Department of Agriculture. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the first things that really came about to me was as we were reorganizing, I wanted to make sure that we had people in place that were going to be a good fit for the new direction that the department or the Division of Agriculture was going to be taking. But when you're looking at organizing, you kind of have a different perspective depending upon what the goal of your department is going to be. So if you are intended on providing services, you want to feed your people, and you want to do that through production means or through sourcing means, your personnel perspectives are going to be a little bit different from somebody that, or from a program that has a primary need for production agriculture. So those are two different knowledge bases. One is more concerned with, service provision and managing resources and getting them out to the populations that you're targeting to serve, versus one that's maybe more enterprise focused from a production perspective. You may need an agronomist like Blake talked about, or you may need somebody with a background in cattle ranching experience. What kind of specific skills are needed? Do you need somebody that knows how to operate heavy machinery, or do you need somebody who's a little more akin or adept with filing reports and the paperwork and compliance components associated with certain federal nutrition programs? And then you can also look at, depending upon if you're interested in hiring somebody new, if you're interested in bringing somebody on who's already at your tribe, or maybe converting their skill set, what training or professional development resources are available to you? Do you have an employment and workforce training program that you can access for tribal citizens that are already employed by the tribe to get them to scale up their own professional development? Do you have a maybe career development plan through HR that allows for reimbursement, or possibly even taking time off to obtain new skills or new education to bring back and work for your tribe? And you can also think about the organizational structure. Is the person you're bringing on, are they going to need to manage anybody? Is that management going to be of tribal employees? Is it going to be of external contractors? Do they need to have certain types of knowledge like contract management or HR skills, or do they need to be trainers themselves for people? So that's something also to think about. And what about your schedule needs? Are you going to be working 24/7? If you're in an enterprise from an agriculture production perspective, harvest is always going to be busy. And how's that going to work with some of the overtime requirements that your tribe may have? Or are you going to put people on salary? If you have a cattle operation, the cows always need fed. So how are you going to structure that type of schedule and that type of rotation? How many people are you actually going to need? Something else to consider from an organizational structure is proximity. A lot of times your tribal headquarters or your tribal campus will not be located immediately adjacent or near some of your production lands or your agricultural assets that you're focusing on. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be agricultural assets. It may even be your wildlife resources or natural resources that are a component of traditional hunting and gathering that you may have sovereignty rights or reserved treaty rights with regard to. So that's something to keep in mind. Does your office need to be on site? Does it need to be on campus for proximity to your decision makers and your administrative support? Or does it make more sense to be located off-site for direct oversight and management? Those are just kind of some things that you need to think about as you're addressing what your needs are. And what kind of technology opportunities do you have? If your tribe is already well connected with broadband, you may be able to maintain an offsite office that's able to communicate rapidly and very readily with your tribal campus, versus if you're in a location where you don't have that type of utility infrastructure available, it may be more challenging to have an offsite office, and it might be better to send a field crew out that reports back at the end of the day. So those are some different considerations. You also need to consider your job descriptions. What kind of educational levels are you looking for? What's common and consistent in your region? Are you going to be able to offer a competitive position? Do you even have the opportunity to hire locally? And that the next part for qualifications and navigating tribal hiring preferences. One of the things that we see in Indian country is that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to developing professional agricultural staff, from getting our tribal students engaged in agriculture at a young age and developing that pipeline to where they're getting the higher education necessary to kind of come out and have a theoretical knowledge of operating a tribal agricultural program with a government structure, because a lot of times, non-tribal colleges don't really focus or emphasize on the administrative components when it comes to running a Department of Agriculture, and it's much more production or agribusiness focused. So there are some nuances there that are specific to tribal agriculture that are particularly important to consider. And when you're writing those job descriptions, you may want to consider A, what's available, and B, what you would like to happen, because that pipeline of professionals is not created, link by link. It needs to start at the beginning, in the middle, and the end. There have to be opportunities to develop that as you go along. So those are some things to consider as you're moving forward from that perspective. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about location and proximity in the previous slide, but you have to do that pro and con analysis of what's going to be the best fit. Do you need direct oversight of that property or that land or that natural resource on a daily basis, and you need somebody out there regularly? You may even need to have somebody, be a caretaker and live on site for whatever types of activities you're undergoing. Maybe your land base is smaller and you can access all locations of where you need to within, a 30-minute or an hour drive. So it doesn't really make very much sense to have a particularly on-site location, and you can be sourced directly there at your tribal campus. We also talked about what technology was available, and as far as technology availability, and it's not just broadband, being able to send an email or getting cell service somewhere. You also need to consider, can you manage some of your operations or your programs remotely with or in the field through handheld smartphones or iPads or tablet devices, and maintain your record keeping on site, and seeing how you can upload that information either directly in the field through a data plan, or if you need to bring that back to the office to manage that. Record keeping is incredibly important when you're talking about any program that you're operating, especially if you are the beneficiary of tribal funds or even federal funds with regard to some of the programs you're working on. So making sure that you're able to track in real time as much as possible is incredibly valuable when you're looking at scaling up your operations. And what infrastructure is available. If you don't have running water or electricity out to a certain parcel, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to try and have an office out there. If your field crew or your on-site manager can't even get in and wash their hands or use the restroom, that's really not a good feasible fit unless your tribe is willing to get the money going to extend the utilities out there, or you're able to leverage some other kind of funding to set up the needs to have an offsite facility. And the other thing to think about is visibility. If you're a large land-based tribe and you have offsite offices that don't bring you up to tribal campus very much, unfortunately, sometimes you get caught in the conundrum of out of sight, out of mind. And if you're not in regular communication with some of your elected officials or your decision makers or your policy makers, sometimes it can get kind of hard to keep them up to date and interested in some of the work that's going on. And I think that's kind of been a little bit consistent when we're talking about tribal agriculture and food systems, especially from a production perspective, that unless you have a stakeholder or a decision maker that is very, very invested in that type of activity, sometimes it's hard to get people interested if they're off-site, and if they don't come or they don't see the work that's actually going on there and see the improvement in the natural resource management, your production activity, what populations you're actually serving. So that visibility, both from an internal and external perspective, can be very important and is something to consider. Next slide. And also think about what the internal roles need to be. We talked a little bit earlier in this webinar about, is your goal to provide a service? Do you want to feed your people? Do you want to generate revenue? Do you want to be engaged in production activity? Do you want to be a receptacle for information and institutional knowledge? Deciding what the priorities are for your tribe, and getting those organized in a manner that you're going to be able to definitively talk about your scope, and the roles are going to be important to figure out as you move forward. So what's your scope? What populations are you going to serve? How are you going to track what you're doing from a programmatic review perspective? Are you going to be able to do a quantitative analysis through, bottom line, how much money are we making, or how much money are we spending, or how much are we harvesting, or how many acres have we returned to production, or how many dollars were we able to capture from external programs, versus a qualitative analysis? How many people are you serving, and are they happy with the services that you're providing? Do they think that you could be doing better? Do they like the quality of the product that they're receiving, whether it's a service or a food basket, or some type of assistance that's housed in your Department of Agriculture? So determining how to get feedback and how to figure out where your opportunities for growth are and where your opportunities for improvement are also important. From an enterprise management perspective, that bottom dollar is going to be something to consider. And how does that fit within a tribal governance structure? If it is an enterprise, does it need to be under tribal government? Does it need to be under a tribally owned business arm? Does it need to be set up as a 501c3 because your ultimate goal, even though you're intended to make revenue, is really to be self-sustaining and then have additional benefits that come off the end of that, whether it's a surplus crop or surplus revenue that's going to be returned to the tribe? So that's something to think about. Maybe this setup is intended for you to be the custodian of expertise. And so you have people that are well-versed and knowledgeable about tribal agriculture to interface with, different organizations, whether it's intertribal, whether it is, consulting with tribal citizens about what opportunities are available to them, or even advising your council, your elected leaders about what options are on the table for them and considerations to think about as they move forward when they make decisions, whether it's from a budgetary perspective or from a programmatic perspective, or even from an organizational perspective. And we talked a little bit about those inter-programmatic relationships. So you may have, as an example, at Muskogee Creek Nation, there was a farm operation, a ranch operation, and a ag youth operation, and they were all independently and separately managed. When that Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources was created, those programs were organized under that umbrella and were streamlined through vertical integration to really start supporting each other and keeping everyone else apprised of the work that was being done instead of being siloed. So there were some cost savings associated with that. There were better communications facilitated through that. And not only within the division, there were better communications and relationships with other programs outside of that division that touched on different components, whether it was land management or whether it was youth activities, whether it was tribal finance or the legal department with regard to some of the contracts that were used. It kind of gave a centralized location for people to go to and say, we need to do X for this particular topic that involves agriculture or involves these type of land management or involves this natural resource. So it's an easy place for somebody to say, oh, you need to call this person over here, instead of having to like work your way through the phone tree or through the organizational chart until you hit what you need to be able to address the question or concern that you have. And the policymaker communication is also particularly important. That's kind of that vertical communication up the chain. If you have a Department of Agriculture, reporting to the department head, or reporting to the cabinet level person, or reporting to your executive leader, depending upon how you're organized, that provides better information and also provides some ideas about direction and scope that maybe your policymakers weren't aware of or don't have a background in. And we see that pretty frequently with agriculture as people have tended to become more urbanized or come off the res, or we've had more fractionated land interests that result in less people being engaged in agricultural pursuits and activities. So sometimes it requires a little bit more organization of what is in existence, what opportunities there are, and how to talk about those from an educated perspective and really empower your policymakers to understand what resources are available and where they can go. Next slide. Oh, back up one more. There we go. And from an external role, we kind of talked a little bit about this already, but outreach, like what service populations are you working with? Tribal citizens, maybe you're wanting to encourage or foster tribal producers to start operations or get operations up and going or put them in touch with markets. What collaborators do you have? Maybe you're producing a product and you need to get additional processing or labeling set up. And so that Department of Agriculture is the unit that will do those communications with your collaborators and work towards accomplishing whatever goals that you think are appropriate. There's also the centralized location for funders and grant makers, to say, hey, who wants some money? And you raise your hand and get that. Or if you're able to access those funds, reporting and feedback directly from that perspective. And we here at FAI are working on an asset map for external funders and grant makers to identify some opportunities to get involved in Indian country from a food and agriculture systems perspective, as well as natural resources. And that communications component externally is important too. Your Department of Agriculture could potentially have policy experts in place from a natural resources perspective, from a production agriculture perspective, from leveraging federal programs perspective, and having a knowledgeable person at the table when you're engaging in consultations or communications with federal, state, and local government are incredibly important. Additionally, information sharing through intertribal partnerships is really important as well. I know the 5 tribes in Oklahoma, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaws meet quarterly to share information. And a lot of times food and natural resource and agriculture information is featured at some of those meetings. So sharing information and sharing resources, especially when you're in similar positions from a cultural perspective or similar positions from a land-based perspective, or even from a geographical perspective, those are very, very valuable. Also, having communications with your trade associations, whether you're producing something specific or you're looking at sourcing something specific, or you're looking at hitting markets that you want to get into or you already are into or want to expand into. Those are some really good resources to have as well. You can also sign up and be a member for certain associations. I know Muskogee Creek Nation is a member of the Cattlemen's Association, and there are other tribes that are members of different organizations and associations as well, to have their voices heard. And that's really important as you get your Department of Ag up and running, identifying what area that you're working in and what policy challenges or issues that you're seeing. Because if we're not represented in some of these general or more mainstream organizations, tribal agriculture and the nuances associated with tribal agriculture are not represented, and they won't necessarily have the same consideration. And a lot of times some policies that may generally be favorable or thought to be favorable for certain agricultural production activities may not be the best fit for Indian country. And if we don't have a seat at the table, we won't be able to discuss those and have our voices heard. So setting up a system where you have your internal experts that are able to communicate externally with the needs and preferences and wants and plans for Indian country agriculture is very, very important. And also media relations and then also public reporting for transparency purposes are certainly things to consider as well. If your Department of Agriculture has programs that are tribally funded, that accountability is very important from an auditing perspective. And I know a lot of tribes publish their annual budgets and their annual audits. So having an internal expert that's able to interpret some of the data associated with the finances and associated with production reports and activities is really important as well. Next slide. So that kind of sums it up. I mean, there's a lot more that we can talk about, but there are a ton of opportunities for your tribe to get involved in whatever direction that your tribe prefers, whether it's production agriculture, whether it's wildlife and land management, whether it's enterprise development, whether it's providing a service or adopting codes and entering that regulatory space. There are a ton of opportunities available. But on this slide, we have everybody who's presented today in the order of their presentation. And I am going to say thank you, everybody, for attending, and I will turn it over to Whitney.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Feel free to submit your questions to the questions dialog box. And as Carly mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us individually. We will be following up with a recording of this webinar as well as the presentation. We will also be including it on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com. And again, one thing that's not included on here, but just as a quick reminder that our Model Tribal Food Code website is tribalfoodcode.com. But feel free to put your questions into the dialog box and we can answer some of those now. And we do have one question. Maybe if, Carly, if you want to expand on an example of tribal departments that have named their departments more broadly to include things such as hunting and fisheries and wild harvesting, mill programs, and land and water.
Sure. So there are a multitude of ways that a tribe can create or organize programs that touch on food systems, natural resources, land management, production agriculture, whatever kind of component that kind of fits within that complete, start to finish food network, food systems, and everything that touches on that. Muscogee Creek Nation says Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Choctaw Nation has some of their enterprises housed under Department of Commerce, and some are under different headings as well. So the organizational formats can really vary depending upon tribe and depending upon preferences. And so there's really a wide variety of that. I will say that our perspective as far as sharing the information and encouraging the creation of a Department of Agriculture is intended to be an organizational format for these types of activities to live in, regardless of what it's named. But the concept is essentially, if we are going to step into the role of food sovereignty as tribal sovereignty, agriculture is a huge component of that, whether it is from a nutrition perspective, whether it's from cultivating the land, or even if we think about it from a specific tribally influenced agriculture, which may even be more expansive than the traditional, production agriculture, and maybe more of a land management to support natural harvest. And I'm thinking of Ojibwe tribes in Minnesota that do a lot of natural resource management for the water systems that grow the wild rice that they're able to harvest. And that's not necessarily traditional agriculture, but it is land and water systems management with the intent of food production. And what that's called or how it's organized is going to vary from tribe to tribe, but there are a lot of tribes that are engaging in different types of activities that support that tribal food sovereignty, regardless of whether it's agriculture or called something else. I'm also thinking of Muscalero Apache and Jicarilla Apache have pretty robust wildlife management programs, not only from a tribal hunting and gathering perspective, but also from a tourism perspective where they invite people in for a revenue generating opportunity associated with that. So there are a multitude of different ways that tribes can organize based on what the focus of their programs are going to be and what their goals and intent are.
Hey, Carly, I would back that up with also looking at the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. They've named their department more broadly to be the Department of Agriculture and Food Systems, and Gary Besaw is their director too, if you're looking at kind of an expansive kind of naming and what might live under that. That's also a place I would point to.
Great, yeah, thank you for that, Blake.
Great, thank you for expanding on that. We do have one question. So if someone's facing some challenges or difficulty with making constitutional changes within the tribe, does organizing under a 501c3 nonprofit allow for a greater opportunity of services through council turnover, or what are some of the primary drawbacks of organizing under a 501 versus a tribal department?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Blake, take that one.
Yeah, I've got some perspective on that too. If you want to go ahead, I'll jump in.
Okay, so there are a couple different things to consider. Your tribe may require constitutional changes for an organizational chart, or it may just require a legislative action through a statutory change. So that's something to maybe consult with your Attorney General's counsel about what is actually required to implement new programs. So taking a look at that, organizing under a 501c3 nonprofit could potentially allow for a greater continuity of services through council turnover. But one of the things that we saw as necessary for the development of the departments of tribal agriculture was being able to retain that institutional knowledge through council and elected turnover. So that's a really great question. If your department head is going to be appointed, you're going to see more turnover through election years. If your department head of agriculture is hired and not appointed by your executive branch or by your business council, then you're going to see less turnover and more institutional knowledge theoretically. If you're working through a 501c3, there are additional constraints associated with what types of operations that your tribe can be engaged in from a funding perspective. So it may be more difficult to allocate 638 self-governance dollars to that 501c3 operation. And there may be less tribal control over the 501c3 operations. There are also benefits from that, like we said, the continuity of services and the reduction of personnel turnover, so you can maintain those operations. So you really just kind of have to determine, what your goals are. If you're looking at doing revenue generation and enterprise management, a 501c3 kind of limits your profit opportunity from that. It's not that you can't make a profit, it's that there are some additional considerations that come with that. And organization structure matters very much, and that's a conversation that needs to be had with your policymakers, with your people that are going to be served by the program, and based on recommendations from legal counsel as well.
Yeah, I'll expand on that with the organizational piece, and this is something I want to hit on. You might have some additional continuity there, but one thing to keep in mind is that the 501c3 is going to be governed by whatever law you incorporate under. So if you have, for instance, tribal leaders want to serve on the board of the 501c3, then those people, maybe their term doesn't run concurrent with their legislative term or something along those lines. So you might have some holdovers from a previous administration that are no longer in leadership, and you might have some ongoing the visions might not line up appropriately in that, so you might have some disconnect there, and that could cause some tension if there's people on board that don't necessarily align with the current vision of leadership. So that would have to be structured kind of strategically, but again, it does open up more doors for funding and certain things with private funding. I mean, perhaps one thing to do is to have a Department of Ag and have everything else headquartered within its own, own little bucket, and you might be able to have a 501c3 arm underneath that Department of Ag for things to live in that might not fit cleanly, or you might have an ability to get additional funding that way, but also having it placed under an ongoing department that's more of a fixture.
Thank you, Blake and Curly. Again, just as a reminder, if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to us. We will be having more live conversations around building a Department of Agriculture, as well as sharing out more of our resources through our website and our social media channels at Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. So be sure to follow along. Reach out to us if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter if you're not already subscribed. We share out a lot of resources and links through that as a way of our communication and sharing that stuff with you all. So with that, I think we will wrap up for today, but thank you everyone for joining us.